Thank you, Thomas. And I, on behalf of ISSID and the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors, I would like to welcome you on to what really is so far the most successful conference, at least regarding the number of participants. 400 delegates from over 30 countries. We never had that before, and that is a good sign not only for ISSID, but in my view it also shows that the field of personality and individual differences is not only alive and well, but is growing and growing. Even more impressive when I looked at the program is the wide variety of topics covered in this conference, from basic research to applied, from cognitive ability constructs to trade approaches, the big five and other ones, from genetic and neuroscience approaches to social psychology approaches, from basic research to practical fields like assessment and clinical work, organizational and other areas of applied psychology. But do not advantages always come with disadvantages? To me, currently the only real drawback is that during the parallel sessions, 4 parallel sessions, I'm not sure whether we had that before, I think the maximum was 3. I remember the times when I visited my first ISSID conference in 1989, it was only 1 session running, and so that is clearly a sign that ISSID and the conference has been growing and growing. This is the only drawback, that we constantly are in the situation to decide between several highly attractive alternatives in the program, and I indeed have a second personal regret that ISSID does not attract much research or researchers from what I currently find one of the most enthralling fields in psychology. So for my presidential address, I decided to show you some of the recent advances in that field. Before I tell you what this is, and you do not find anything about this in the program, I must admit that choosing a topic for my presidential address was not an easy enterprise. Those who know me well might expect that I tell you something about intelligence and the brain. Unfortunately, I did exactly that a year ago at the biennial conference of our, let's say, sister society, the European Association of Personality Psychology meeting. There I was invited to give a keynote lecture on the topic, where in the brain is intelligence. And as perhaps some of you might have attended that meeting and heard my talk there, I thought this time I had to do something different. This is the wrong one, sorry. Where is mine? This one. Okay. So, last year it was where in the brain is intelligence, and I have a second, let's say, scientific passion, and that is the field of creativity. So this time I want to tell you something about where in the brain is creativity. And as a subhead for my talk, I choose, let's say, an adaptation of a title of a book I like very much, you know, Ian Deary's Looking Down on Human Intelligence. I will focus on divergent thinking, so looking down on divergent thinking. Why am I have to get this here. Why am I going to present you an, let's say, overview with a focus on my own research or on our research on creativity? In fact, and this is not reflected at ISSID conferences, creativity is a proliferating field. Hennessy and Amabile, in a very nice review in 2010, in Annual Review of Psychology, justify or say that the reason probably is that creativity is one of the key factors that drive civilization forward. The field is in fact very active. We have recently seen the launching of several new journals, Psychology of Creativity, Aesthetics and the Arts, an international journal of creativity and problem solving, or journal of thinking skills and creativity. And the other two journals in this field are also alive and well, traditional journals in this field. Moreover, apart from the general review by Hennessy and Amabile, there are also some more recent reviews on neuroscience approaches to creativity by Arden and Al and Dietrich and Kenzo. And last year also the tradition of the handbook of creativity has been continued. Those who know a little bit about this field know that every 10 years a new edition of this handbook of creativity is being published. What is creativity? Creativity is the ability to produce work that is novel, useful and generative. So it is, let's say, viewed by Sternberg and Neubauer as a trait, or another definition that focuses on the products. Creativity can be defined as an idea or product that is original, valued and implemented. It goes without saying that creativity is important for in education and school, mainly also with the aim of increasing the economy of a country. Therefore, it plays a big role, an important role in human resources research, in personal selection and personal development, of course in art, science and culture, and it is considered a sign of mental health and emotional well-being. Creativity research is surprisingly heterogeneous. In this figure you can see the many different approaches. I try to systematize them a little bit. In the lower part of the slide you can see the, let's say, more trait-oriented approaches which deal with the relationship between creativity and intelligence, of course, relationship with personality, the importance of motivation and of knowledge and expertise. Other approaches have focused on the process, especially on the incubation process, and the three upper fields, let's say, are more involved with the, let's say, improvement, the fostering of creativity. They deal with question in how far creativity can be enhanced through positive mood, for example, the influence of social interactions and groups, as well as the question, can you simply train creativity? However, as you know, creativity, other than or unlike other areas of assessment, is not easy to measure. You know, one of the old approaches, or the historically probably oldest approach, was suggested by Joy P. Guilford with the suggestion of so-called divergent thinking tasks. Divergent thinking is not the same as creativity, we know that, but most authors see divergent thinking as a valid indicator of some kind of creative potential. There are other approaches as well, for example, the assessment of creative achievements and the assessment of, let's say, originality of products through experts, but I will not go into that field, but rather focus on the divergent thinking approach. Guilford suggested tasks that are open, that allow for a lot of solutions, so as opposed to convergent thinking tasks like, for example, analogies, where you have only one single correct solution. Divergent tasks allow for many solutions. For example, well-known task, the utopian situations. Imagine there were a creeping plant rising up to the sky. What would you await at the end of this plant? Guilford suggested to measure or to derive three kinds of measures from this task. Ideational fluency, that is simply the number of responses, you know that. Flexibility, the question from how many categories come the responses, and the degree of originality or novelty of the responses. Probably the most popular test internationally is the Torrance test of creative thinking. You see, there are not only such utopian situations, for example, but also figural divergent thinking tasks. But some authors have also pointed out that creativity is rather domain-specific, which explains the sometimes rather poor validity of creativity tests. And still, let's say, open or unresolved question is the relationship between creativity and intelligence. Joy Guilford has proposed the threshold hypothesis, that intelligence, or that views intelligence as a necessary but not sufficient condition for creativity. That means creative people should be intelligent too, but not every intelligent person must necessarily be creative. Empirically, this prediction should look like this. That means when you plot the relationship and you cut the distribution of intelligence into, let's say, two halves. For people of lower intelligence, there should be a positive relationship, and for people of high intelligence, there should be no more relationship. And though this hypothesis seems very attractive and intuitively plausible, it has not really been confirmed ever, at least not systematically, as was shown in a meta-analysis by Kim, who collected around 20 studies on that topic and found a mean correlation of 0.17. And when dividing the sample into lower than 120 versus higher than 120, you can see the two correlations, 0.20 and 0.235, do not really differ. But generally, the correlations are very heterogeneous, depending on age and also on the creativity test used. So Hennessy and Amabile have pointed out an important conceptual difference, namely that intelligence is used to advance existing social agendas, whereas creative thinking involves often opposes these agendas and involves the proposition of new agendas, and that what is needed is a balance between intelligence and creativity. What about the relationship with personality? Here also we have quite a lot of findings which do not give a really clear picture so far. Unfortunately, there is only an older meta-analysis by Feist who showed that most systematic relationships have been found with openness to experience, with conscientiousness, exactly a lack of conscientiousness, with self-acceptance and hostility and impulsivity. A newer review, not meta-analytic, by Beatty and Fernham showed that the relationship seems to depend strongly on the domain of creativity. So, whereas when you compare artistic versus scientific or everyday creativity, you can see that the correlations for openness and psychoticism is always positive, but especially for conscientiousness, there are almost opposite relationships as well as for neuroticism. So for artistic creativity, it seems to be good to be, let's say, not emotionally so stable, and for scientific creativity, conscientiousness is quite important. Now, I will come to the main part of my talk, and this is experimental and neuroscience approaches how to study divergent thinking processes. I will focus on task and response characteristics in the first part, to individual differences in creativity and intelligence in the second part, and I will also show you whether training and stimulation of creativity is reflected in brain activation patterns. All what I will show you, and this is maybe an important difference to what we heard in the morning about intelligence and brain imaging. This is, for creativity, there's almost only research on functional brain imaging, not on structural brain imaging. There are only, and therefore I will not show you that there is not even a handful of studies on structural imaging correlates of creativity. An important impulse for the, let's say, renaissance or the neuroscience renaissance of creativity research, although it has not directly to do with divergent thinking, came from a study by Mark Young Beeman and co-workers, who tested their subjects with the well-known remote associates problems. And you can see here an example. You have to find a compound with three given stimulus words, pine, crab, sauce, and the solution is apple, for example. And then they asked the subjects whether that was a sudden insight, an aha experience, or whether it was a non-insight solution. And what they found is that people, or for those trials where people reported aha or insight solutions, they showed more alpha power in some posterior parietal brain regions of the right hemisphere. This would be in, or this looks in like a nice conformity with the previously dominant neurophysiological theory of creativity. You have maybe heard about that, Colin Martindale's low arousal theory. He posited that the production of original ideas more likely occurs when the individual is in a state of low cortical arousal, because in this brain state, individuals can more easily relate remote associations that are broadly distributed over the whole brain, combining them into a new creative output. Empirically, he has shown already in the late 70s that high creative individuals showed more EEG alpha during alternate uses test, and that highly creative individuals displayed more alpha during inspirational phases, as compared to elaboration phases. A number of subsequent studies have seem to have confirmed that view, showing, for example, also that divergent thinking is characterized by more alpha power. You remember the oscillations between 8 and 12 or 13 hertz, which was interpreted as support for the low arousal theory. But as you will see later, I will challenge that view. Moreover, other studies have shown a higher EEG complexity with divergent thinking or with higher creativity. That's a measure derived from chaos theory, and also that there is more communication within the brain, more inter and more intra-hemispheric coherence. That means a higher similarity of brain activity, of brain waves between even distant areas. Now I will show you our approach that we followed in Graz at the differential psychology unit of my university. We use several creativity tasks, partially new, partially adapted from the literature. But in fact, the new thing that we, let's say, proposed is really to find out that moment when the people have that idea, and we ask what happens exactly in that time interval, 1, 2, 3 seconds, for example, before people generate an idea. So they are in the EEG or in the fMRI scanner, have to press a button when they have an idea and then verbalize this idea. And we then look what happens in the brain before that moment or in that moment when they had this idea. First is a comparison of task and response characteristics. So our first study we tried to compare, is there a difference in the brain when people produce more or less original responses? So we presented the subjects with insight tasks and with such utopian situations. And generally we found for these tasks that there is a stronger alpha synchronization. You can see here the alpha power, and these are the cortical areas from frontal to posterior areas. And you see much more alpha than in the posterior areas of the brain. But the even more interesting finding that we obtained is that when we compared the high original to the low original ideas, we find a difference, namely more alpha in some frontal areas as well as in some parietal or temporal areas. So that was the first finding, which first we interpreted in accordance with the Martindale view of lower arousal. But then then there were from other fields some other findings that questioned that view and who showed that alpha synchronization, and you always, probably most of you thought that this means some kind of cortical deactivation or idling, but in fact other areas or studies from other areas suggested that in fact areas with more alpha can be even more active. For example, when you simultaneously look at the Bolt reaction in the fMRI scanner. So we did the same in another study in which we compared originality instructions. We did exactly that. That means we used the same tasks in our EEG lab as well as in an fMRI scanner. And basically the purpose of this study was to compare with the same stimulus materials, namely conventional everyday objects were given as a stimulus, for example, tin or shoes, and in one condition they had to name alternative uses, in another condition, let's say uncreative condition, they had simply to name object characteristics. Now, with the EEG, we found that the alternative uses in fact produced again more alpha as expected, whereas in the object characteristics task you rather found partially even a desynchronization of the EEG. But the more important thing is what happens when you compare that to the same tasks administered in other subjects, but comparable sample, when you do the measurement with fMRI. And you see that those areas who showed alpha synchronization, especially the frontal areas, were more active. So they showed more bolt reaction, more blood flow in the brain, accompanied with an alpha synchronization. So this, in fact, questions the low arousal theory of Colin Martindale. First, it points, of course, to the, but that is not a big surprise, to the importance of frontal and mostly parietal brain areas. That is very simple to the PFIT theory in intelligence. But we found that in divergent thinking tasks, frontal alpha synchronization goes along with stronger bolt responses, more blood flow in the when doing fMRI scanning. And this questions the traditional interpretation of alpha synchronization as a cortical idling phenomenon. Rather, and this is the suggestion, frontal alpha is a kind of active inhibitory top-down control. The brain, let's say, protects itself from interfering cognitive processes, internal processes, as well as from external output. This is not the only evidence that speaks in favor of this hypothesis. There are many other studies supporting this view as well. Back to the study I mentioned before, another finding is what happens when we contrast the alternative uses and the object characteristics. And you can see here that, interestingly, in the original alternative uses tasks, some areas, the blue areas, are less active, and this is mainly parietal areas extending into the supramarginal gyrus. Only one small area, depicted in red, was more active in the original task. So the conclusion from this study was that creative idea generation has on one hand to do something with activation of the frontal cortex, but at the same time with deactivation in right hemisphere parietal temporal regions, which became apparent when we contrasted the object characteristics with the alternative uses task. And we interpreted that as an inhibition of prevalent automatically activated knowledge from memory in order to allow for the generation of novel original ideas. Second part, individual differences in creativity and intelligence. We wanted to know, is brain activation different for low versus high creative individuals, especially people who produce more original or less original responses as evaluated by an independent group of experts. And here we found that in higher original individuals, again, right hemisphere posterior areas seem to play a certain role. They show more alpha power so more alpha here in the right hemisphere for subjects who produce higher original ideas, whereas this hemispheric difference is not found in individuals who produce less original ideas. Another interesting finding, and that in fact is a finding from the study I reported before when we compared the brain states between low and high original ideas, is that we also observed a rather complex interaction with intelligence. Namely that for the production of low original ideas, you can see that the two brain patterns do not differ at all, whereas for high original ideas do not differ, I forgot to mention, between average and high verbal IQ subjects, whereas for high original ideas, the high verbal IQ group showed much more frontal alpha power as compared to the average verbal IQ group. And this, let's say, reminds one a little bit of the threshold hypothesis. So it seems that maybe a certain level of intelligence seems to be required to get into this, let's say, creative brain state. That would be our interpretation. The final part of my talk is what about training and stimulation of creativity. There is, in fact, a lot of research literature on different approaches to train, to foster creativity. Cognitive trainings have been suggested, so to practice creativity. Cognitive stimulation, mostly done by sharing other people's ideas, so simply presenting, when you present the subjects with such a divergent thinking task, you show them the ideas of other people. That has often positive effects. Effective stimulation is a third approach, mostly through positive effects. And finally, a fourth approach is to induce in some way creative brain states, studies on biofeedback, or even on brain stimulation. With TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, you can even influence brain activity from outside in healthy subjects, and this has also been done with positive findings. Our first study we did several years ago was to train subjects with a computerized divergent thinking training. The subjects got that on a CD, they could take it at home, and for a pre-test they came to the lab, then they trained for 2 weeks, half an hour training per week, and then after 2 weeks they came to the lab again. And what we found is really that the subjects produced more original ideas, so behaviorally there was a positive effect of that training, and we found increases in frontal alpha activity as a result of the training. Here you can see the training. That was in fact a comparison with a control group who received no training, that this training group showed more, let's say, more creative brain states. Another approach we followed rather recently is to look at the effects of cognitive stimulation. Cognitive stimulation that means exposing the subjects to other people's ideas. It is called idea sharing, can lead to the priming of new ideas, but it can also have detrimental negative effects, for example, production blocking or conformity effects, or but in fact the question about the direction of the effect is strongly dependent on the quantity and quality of the shared ideas. We did recently, co-workers of mine did recently a study in which we, in the fMRI scanner, used the classical alternative uses task and compared three conditions. One condition was to present a single object, everyday object, like a tin, for example, and let's say the ideas, the shared ideas, were either very original, like mini biotope or cocktail shaker, or they were of a rather common type. Conserve food, throw it, and as a control, you know, fMRI, you always need a control condition. We simply presented some nonsense words. And interestingly, behaviorally, we found that the common condition, that means idea sharing with common ideas, led to higher originality than the idea sharing with original ideas. Both were better than the control condition, although the sample was rather small, only that difference reached significance. So what happens when we look at brain activation? The general effect of cognitive stimulation was that both stimulation conditions contrasted to the control condition resulted in higher left hemispheric activation of the middle temporal gyrus, might indicate stronger activation and retrieval of semantic information, and both stimulation conditions also resulted in lower right hemispheric activation of regions of the dorsal parietal lobe and some other adjacent areas. According to Cabeza and co-authors, this would mean a low attentional focus on memory retrieval. And we also compared what happens, I should have shown you that before, what happens specifically when we when we compare the more successful condition stimulation with common ideas compared to the control condition. Here we also found the importance of frontal area. Left superior frontal gyrus was more activated, which has maybe something to do with working memory, and also interestingly lower activation of areas of the right temporoparietal junction. So I would come to an end and summarize and conclude. Creativity, but this is not so surprising, relies on the coordinated interplay of frontal and posterior, mostly parietal, but also some temporal brain areas. That is quite similar to the P-fit theory for intelligence. But what is interesting is that frontal alpha synchronization associated with creative thinking goes along with stronger bold responses in the fMRI. So alpha synchronization is more some kind of active inhibition or inhibitory top-down control to protect sozusagen, so to say, the brain not to become disturbed by internal processes or by external stimulation. Brain activity is different when generating original versus less original ideas. or when being instructed towards originality. But here we have the opposite pattern, that more parietal alpha power, interestingly, goes along with lower bold reactions in fMRI, which we interpret in accordance with other findings of the literature as the inhibition of prevalent automatically activated knowledge from memory to allow for novel ideas. We found individual differences. Brain activity is different in more versus less creative people. We found interactions with intelligence, and we showed that there is, let's say, training effects for creativity can be reflected also at the neurophysiological level. Of course, there are limitations. Divergent thinking is not creativity, but is an important prerequisite, probably. And if you take a look at the nice review by Dietrich and Kenzo, comparison of brain imaging studies who also studied artistic creativity or who studied insight, show that there is only one prominent commonality, namely a diffuse prefrontal activation that is similar also found for intelligent tasks. And for artistic creativity and studies on insight, partially different brain areas are being activated. I like very much the conclusion by Dietrich and Kenzo. Creative thinking does not depend on any single mental process or brain region, and it is not especially associated with right brains, with defocused attention, low arousal, or alpha synchronization as sometimes hypothesized. Yeah, and as I said before, there is almost nothing so far, only a very few studies on neurophysiological, on neurostructural correlates of creativity. This is still an open field for research. And with a big thank you to my co-workers, one former, Andreas Fink, and Matthias Benedek, my current co-worker, who is also at the conference. I like to thank my co-workers and you for your attention. Thank you very much.